Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, how does rebirth work? If I have no self, then what experiences reincarnation after this body dies?
This is a good question. The Buddha teaches that we don't have a soul, and so there is no soul that can undergo reincarnation. But that doesn't mean that reincarnation doesn't happen. No, instead, it is the component elements that make each of us aggregate and reaggregate into different forms over time based on our karma that undergo reincarnation.
Fascinating. So, if we're karmically good, then our component elements will be reborn into good circumstances, and if we are karmically bad, then our components fall into bad circumstances. Good causes lead to good conditions, and negative causes lead to negative conditions.
Correct. And this also applies to our situation here and now. If we're karmically good, our immediate situation will be improved, and if we're karmically bad, then it will be made worse.
This makes sense. When we do a good act for another, it makes us feel good. Similarly, when we do evil, it makes us feel guilty.
Exactly. This good or bad momentum that is created by what we introduce into the world determines what our situation will be like in the present as well as in the near future.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be discussing reincarnation. Shout out to our patron Tanner for submitting the following question. How does rebirth really work in Buddhism? What actually undergoes rebirth? We hope you enjoy.
For this episode, we're going to try something new and reverse the format for a moment. First, I'll ask Docs this question, and then after he gives his answer, I'll give mine, correcting anything that needs to be corrected. So, Docs, how does rebirth really work in Buddhism?
I wanted to take the lead on this question because I think we've indirectly answered it in other episodes, but we haven't really drilled down to the point all at once. So this is me attempting to gather what I've learned from my side of the podcast and apply it to this question. So, in a couple of past episodes, I've mentioned that Buddhist stories and doctrines have a uniquely fractal quality. What I'm pointing to here is that there is a pattern that applies at all scales in Buddhism. Every rule applies to everything in more or less the same way. With that in mind, I think the answer to what actually experiences reincarnation is everything in samsara. Off the top of my head, it'd be easier to point out things that don't experience reincarnation instead. Those who have achieved nirvana, just by definition, and the Dharma itself. The only possible exception to nirvana we've encountered so far was in the Lotus Sutra with Prabhu Gunaratna, and he isn't actually being reincarnated there, he's just reappearing as the same being. The Dharma doesn't reincarnate because it sits outside of samsara and is the same everywhere. Our knowledge and understanding of the Dharma can change and can die, but when Maitreya eventually shows up, he will be rediscovering the same Dharma that Shakyamuni did. So that means more or less everything else undergoes reincarnation. On a scale that is relevant to humans, the main answers are the five aggregates. So to review, since it's been a while since we've talked about those, Rupa, our physical form, our bodies, they get eaten or decay over time, components being reused in life forms that come after us. This doesn't even really require the body's death. We shed dead skin, replace dead blood cells, and similar functions while we're still alive even. Next is Vedana. Our sensations get altered based on what sense organs our bodies possess and the circumstances around our lives. Smells or textures that are pleasant in one context may be horrible in another, and vice versa. Samjna. Our perceptions or categorical knowledge. This doesn't even require a physical death for reincarnation. There are many ways in which our knowledge changes through our lives. There are things I knew, quote-unquote, as a child that I now know to be false, and I suspect if I live long enough to be an old man, there will be many things I look at very differently than I do now in my late 30s. Next is Sankhara. Our mental activities also change significantly over time, just over a single lifetime. The explanation is pretty much the same as I just said for perceptions. As we grow, our mind changes and evolves. And the last is Vijnana, consciousness. This is the part that I think is most relevant to people's conception of the afterlife. It seems like the closest thing to an air quotes soul in Buddhism. And I've also seen a lot of air quotes rational-minded people talking about consciousness in similar terms to how religious people talk about souls. As I understand it, this is the thing that goes through the afterlife through Bardo between existences and is what is most directly propelled by someone's karma into different realms of rebirth. A sentient being is a unique combination of those aggregates, and I'm not even sure unique is correct in that definition. So the way reincarnation works is that upon death, a sentient being's 5 aggregates separate and go on to be used in different beings. This gets us non-self in 2 different levels. For one, the combination of the 5 aggregates leaves no space for there to be a single thing that is an individual. It's always a combination of several things. For 2, because of this exchange of aggregates and the mind-melting timescale that Buddhism works on, chances are extremely high that some portion of the 5 aggregates, quote-unquote, I currently possess, were also possessed at one point by any, quote-unquote, other given person I'm interacting with. This is interpenetration. On a grander scale, and admittedly with a loose definition of rebirth or reincarnation, things larger than humans also are affected. Mountains rise and eroded, lakes form and dry out, rivers meander, continents move, etc. This still holds true when you zoom out to a cosmic scale. Earth/Jambudvipa is one of many worlds, and all of them are in a constant cycle of creation and destruction. In the Buddhist case, this came from the cosmology of the time. The world going through cycles of creation and destruction is an idea that's a lot older than Buddhism. That said, it still kind of applies today if you can stomach reading some modern context back into old texts. We've complained about that before, but I think it makes for an interesting story, so going to continue with it for the moment here. We know scientifically that stars have finite lifespans, and that the materials that make them up get incorporated into other stellar objects after they die. At least for some classes of stars. I am not an astronomer, I don't know the specifics of that process. Zoom out even further, we have a theory for how our universe started, the Big Bang. There are also theories or speculation on how our universe might die, such as the Big Crunch or heat death. One could also speculate on ways a new universe or universes might arise after this one's death, though as far as I know, that's beyond our ability to figure out from our perspective. So, yeah, that's applying that fractal quality here. Reincarnation includes almost everything at every scale.
This is a really good answer, and it's almost entirely textually correct. I'm going to discuss your answer point by point, and then we will continue with some more questions. The first point that's important to mention is that at the beginning of your answer you mentioned that there are things that do not undergo reincarnation, namely the Dharma and those who have achieved nirvana. You're totally right to say that people who have attained nirvana do not reincarnate. That's the very definition of nirvana. It's extinction or blowing out and not coming back. However, you said that the Dharma does not undergo reincarnation, and the reason you gave for that is that it sits outside of samsara. You're right to say that it doesn't reincarnate, but it does not necessarily sit outside samsara either. One of the most frequent cognitive mistakes that the Buddha says we all make is letting the pitfalls of language railroad our understanding of the world around us. We refer to the Dharma as a capital T thing, and so we think that it is a thing that exists somehow. However, it's still an open question in Buddhism what the Dharma actually is. Early Buddhism says that it is the true nature of reality. If we use the analogy that all of reality is a simulation, then the Dharma is the source code. And when people reach enlightenment, that is them being able to read that source code and understand how it makes the simulation behave the way that it does. It's the set of principles, boundaries, and rules by which the world around us operates. As a result, it isn't outside of samsara, it's actually probably more like the foundation or the fundamental coding behind samsara.
I have 2 replies to that. So first, you're talking about the Dharma as foundation for samsara. In my mind, it's more a container for samsara. We're in the Dharma of the Dharma, but the Dharma encompasses much more than us. And containers are outside of the things they contain. That's where the word outside comes from in my answer. I would also argue that when I was in software development, I would have argued that the source code contains what it's coding. But that's an entirely different field and way of approaching things that makes that kind of just my personal way of looking at how source code looks as someone who has written a lot of source code for stuff. So second is, my understanding is that the three marks of existence, that is, the three things that all lowercase dharmas share, are dukkha, anatta, and anicca, or dissatisfaction, no soul/non-self, and impermanence. The idea of anatta doesn't really apply to the dharma because it's not an individual, leaving Vairocana aside for the moment. But from where I'm sitting, it looks like dukkha and impermanence don't apply to the dharma. So that sets it in some way apart from samsara.
Both of your points bring up a very important question that is still up for debate. We're sitting here asking each other, what is the dharma? And we're trading answers back and forth. We could hand wave and say that the dharma is everything and everything is the dharma, and we could solve that problem. Is the dharma a container? Yes. Is it also the foundation and the original cause? Yes. This is all because it is everything all the time. But to be able to hand wave like this requires us to take a specific interpretation of the dharma and its nature that is contextual and specific to a time and place in history. There's actually a living commentarial debate which asks the question, is the dharma the foundation of samsara, which makes it the original cause for all that we see and experience, including suchness and emptiness and dukkha and so on and so forth? Or is it the totality of reality as it is and could be, making it a container and that which is contained all at the same time? I have seen very compelling arguments for one, the other, and even for both. It is possible for the dharma to be a container, an original cause, and the contained all at the same time because of the sheer universality of it. The rules don't apply to the rules themselves. The rules are just rules. They point at how something functions or ought to function in the world around us. As a result, the dharma being those rules, and also being that which the rules apply to, in some sense, it isn't subject to impermanence because it is a signifier for universally true principles, including impermanence itself. Some schools and traditions often argue that there is so much that is ineffable about the dharma because of this very reason. It's so much larger and more complicated and more universal than can be captured by the words of the teaching themselves. And getting captured by the inadequacy of the words we use to talk about the dharma, we miss the dharma itself. If you spend too much time talking about what the moon looks like, you're just kind of spinning wheels. If you want to know what the moon really looks like, you have to actually look at the moon itself. Thus, the argument is you will understand the dharma if you actually realize it in your life, rather than spending too much time talking about it, debating about it, and considering it, using language. The problem, however, is that people who are regarded as being enlightened still have different answers over time to the question of what is dharma. I'll leave it there by saying that the most likely case is that the dharma is the foundation and the container and a great deal of the contained all at once. I want to briefly pick back up your second point there because it contains some interesting and important stuff. Like I said a moment ago, the dharma is not subject to the marks of existence because it is the marks of existence, and therefore is universal and constitutes the metaphorical pillars of reality. As a result, you're right to say that the dharma itself is not subject to non-self, unsatisfactoriness, and impermanence. The fact that you bring up Vairocana, however, is interesting and important for several reasons. We've talked about Vairocana as being the whole universe, and the whole universe as being Vairocana. If there is an individual like Vairocana who is the dharma, what is the nature of his selfhood? It is the same as all other selfhoods, which is that it is non-self. This is made evident by the fact that we are all part of Vairocana's dharma body, or his world text. This is his universal nature. This is a stage in Buddhist thought where a fully realized Buddha, the individual, and the dharma itself, ultimate reality, have come to be regarded as one and the same. It's complicated and tough stuff, but it is interesting to think about because in that interpretation, the dharma is an individual, namely Vairocana, and that individual is quite literally everything, all there is, all the time. It's an interesting kind of monism, which is the philosophy that the fundamental nature of reality is all singular or all one in some form. This stuff may seem disconnected to the issue of reincarnation, but it actually does connect in an important way. If the Dharma is thought of as being wholly outside of samsara and not containing, which is, I know, not what you were saying before, but is an important hypothetical for teaching purposes, then it could be easy to come to think of the Dharma as a non-personified arbiter of what happens in samsara, or in philosophy of religion terms, the prime mover. If one were to think that way, they would believe that reincarnation and karma and so forth are all personally overseen and handled by the Dharma itself, or they're operated upon by the Dharma itself. It would be easy to think that it too would cause there to be dukkha, impermanence, and emptiness, and could decide for there not to be those things. This is not the case. The Dharma, even when it is regarded as one and the same as Vairocana, it is not like that. If we think of it simply as a container for all things, that makes more sense, but it does not explain causality as it is presented in Buddhism. All things arise due to causes and conditions. Does that only happen inside the realm of the Dharma? If so, then what is the cause for the Dharma? There's no clear or productive answer to that question. If you think of it as the foundation of the arising of everything, that solves that problem, but the question arises as to how unwholesome things can arise as a result of such a wholesome cause, such as the Dharma. And many are left unsatisfied with the answers to that question. Thus, for reincarnation, karma, and non-self to truly work properly, the Dharma must be both the container, the contained, the original cause, all at once, without being this personified, personal overseer of what happens in samsara. Now, the next question that comes out of this is, if the Dharma is the foundation for samsara, why is dukkha allowed to occur? This question is essentially the problem of theodicy. Theodicy is the famous paradox in Christianity, which poses the question, if God is universally good and omnipotent and benevolent, why does evil and suffering exist? The question in Buddhism is, if the Dharma is a universally good and pure and perfect cause, why does dukkha result from that cause? Or how does dukkha result from that cause? This is a very tough question with lots of interpretations in Buddhism. The early Buddhism answer would be that bad karma causes sentient beings to have delusion or ignorance with regards to the Dharma. Karma itself is regarded as a passive property of the universe like gravity. So, there is not a person or any kind of being in charge of what happens to people. This is where a lot of people who come up in a Judeo-Christian background get stuck. The Buddha does not assign karma or decide what's good and bad. The Dharma doesn't do this. Nothing does this. The Dharma can be universally good, and people can still bounce off of it and be bad in response. What is good karma and what is bad karma are thought to be inherent properties of the universe, and sentient beings are the ones who willingly live accordingly. As a result, dukkha exists. The later Buddhist answer would be that desire, ignorance, and dukkha, and more, are all part of the Dharma, and so it would be a misunderstanding to say that Dharma is causing dukkha, but rather that part of the Dharma is dukkha. I won't go too much further into it because there are far more confusing and difficult answers to this problem.
I also have thoughts on the origins of dukkha, but they're more game designer/writer ideas than Buddhist ones. Perhaps in a later episode we can go over those more difficult answers in depth.
Yes, absolutely. The next point about the 5 aggregates being the core of how reincarnation works is totally correct. The 5 aggregates are the answer to the question, if we have no capital S self, then what do we have? We have form, and form leads to sensation, and sensation leads to perceptions that this sensation is good or bad or neutral. And we have perceptions that lead to mental activities such as avoiding sensory stimuli that we have judged to be bad. And human beings are aware of these mental activities, which is consciousness. Consciousness in Buddhism is where we store memory and where we engage in categorical and calculative thinking. And it is our ability to choose what we seek out, and thus it's the place where karmic activity occurs. We can seek our karmically good stuff and fill our consciousness with good stuff, or we can seek out bad and fill it with bad. So in concrete terms, my consciousness is my ability to be aware that I avoid putting my hand into boiling water, because that is a sensation that I have deemed as unpleasant. And so I'm also aware that I seek out eating chocolate, because that is a sensation that I've deemed to be a pleasant one. It is my ability to cultivate loving kindness and compassion for all sentient beings, which is karmically good. or it's my ability to cultivate disdain for sentient beings, which is karmically bad. All of this occurs in the consciousness. Whenever we die, these things disaggregate. The physical components of our bodies dissolve, and so our sensory organs no longer sense, and we no longer are able to deem sensations as good or bad, and so we no longer seek or avoid, and we no longer are aware of seeking and avoiding. On the point you mentioned about the consciousness going through the intermediate period between this life and the next one in the course of reincarnation, that's actually not technically canonical to Buddhism. That's more of an inherited understanding of death that comes from indigenous religions adjacent to Buddhism. In these Buddhism-adjacent religions, consciousness is thought of as being like a spirit or a soul that needs to be propitiated and protected in order to safely get to the next rebirth. Additionally, you're right to say that each aggregation is a totally and completely unique orchestration of the 5 aggregates of the elements of the universe. That is, even if one were hypothetically to clone you, that clone would not be thought of as being the exact same orchestration or aggregation as you, because you already exist. So a clone couldn't be an exact replica of you. It could only be a near copy of you, because you're already here. The next part of your answer, about how the physical components and such of ourselves are reaggregated, and how that is representative of non-self, that's all completely correct, and all totally canonical to Buddhism. In Buddhism, we've talked about how karma represents momentum toward one situation or another at every single time scale and every single scale of how much is affected by our behaviors. So when we do something karmically good, it makes us feel good in the moment, and it leads to good in the near, middle, and distant future. This karma is momentum, which causes the 5 aggregates to aggregate again in some fashion. Karmic bad will make it aggregate into something bad, karmic good will make it aggregate into something good, and karmic neutral will maintain the same state that you're in now. You made a point about how it's possible to think that our components get reaggregated into multiple other beings. I personally think that this is true and that it is supported by the sole concept of reincarnation and by modern scientific evidence that we can observe around us in the world. But it's important to note that this is also not canonical. In the text, the idea is that one creature, be it a human, a hungry ghost, or a god, is reincarnated into another one single creature. I can't give a solid reason as to why this is the thought process, other than to say that the idea that our aggregated components go on to be used by multiple organisms is a scientific idea, and Buddhism is pre-scientific thought. Your next point about mountains, lakes, and rivers and the universe, and so on, all undergoing change and what we might interpret as rebirth, is also canonically correct, and true due to the doctrine of impermanence and emptiness. But it also, importantly, does not necessarily fall under the purview of reincarnation or rebirth. Reincarnation is something that only sentient beings undergo in Buddhism.
That's fair. Even the moment I was aware I was stretching definitions. Recreation might be a better term for what happens at larger scales than rebirth. My instinct there was to apply that fractal pattern I mentioned before, which would mean that these rules apply to things much bigger than us as well.
That's a fair move to make, and a reasonable assessment of the overall logic of Buddhist thinking, which is very much fractal-like in many cases. It's important to remember that impermanence still applies directly to the doctrine of reincarnation. There were some Brahmanical Hindu schools that thought and that argued that reincarnation was a process that happened to the equivalent of a soul, and that the soul just kept being recycled into different bodies. Because of emptiness and impermanence, we cannot say that there is any such soul to speak of. According to impermanence, everything that arises must cease, and an eternal and everlasting soul, by definition, cannot cease. Furthermore, because everything that arises must cease, one cannot say that there is anything that has permanent, substantial, eternal existence. That absence is emptiness, and it also disqualifies a soul. However, reincarnation is still possible, one might even say necessary, in this system. Impermanence also argues that things arise due to causes and conditions, and that something cannot be created from nothing, and something cannot become nothing. That being the case, the only option that we have left open to us is reincarnation. If any aspect of ourselves just died, just turned into absolutely nothing when we died, that would violate the rule of impermanence. So our continued arising in this world occurs, but not with anything like a soul,
We hope you enjoyed our discussion of reincarnation in Buddhism, and thank you to our patron Tanner for submitting that question. Join us next week where we will discuss how to distinguish between esoteric and exoteric Buddhist teachings. What is the difference between exoteric and esoteric teachings? Where does this classification come from and why? How ought we understand this division? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, producer, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like for us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, a review, or subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com, or find us on Patreon at patreon.com/brightonbuddhism. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.